I've been reminded. I was so excited. I forgot to hit record. I'm sorry.
Yeah, great.
Thank you. I just started it now. Great work. We're hoping to see some drugs coming out of your efforts. Help us get through this difficult time. I want to ask the other participants as well. What is your view? Where do you see AI outside of medicine and healthcare? Is it being widely deployed, or is it still is it still not in a way that we can see it as much? Is it all still in the processes rather than in the products that we're seeing? I mean, we see it in Alexa and things like that, but Sam or Rob?
Here, Rob's got his hand up.
Rob.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, you can.
So I'll give two answers to this. So first of all, AI is everywhere, right? So here's my iPhone. You guys can see this. There's a lot of AI-enabled tools in here that I use every single day, maps in particular, right? So there's lots of AI in lots of little places all throughout the entire economy. Now, I didn't warn you I was going to do this, and I actually didn't realize I was going to do it until just now, but I'm going to try to share a slide, if it's going to let me do it. I'm just going to try it very briefly. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. Okay, can you see this?
It's coming.
Yes, we can. Yes.
Okay, so the big question is, how do you go about measuring this, right? I mean, we all have anecdotes. We heard a wonderful anecdote a moment ago about drug discovery. I gave you the anecdote about the iPhone, but how do we go about systematically measuring it? It's really, really hard to do. And so we can look at some statistics, stuff like VC funding, that's what's on this slide here, patent applications, all that stuff has gone up. But, and this is really what I want to show you, all of this is still a really, really tiny fraction of overall business investment. So these are some numbers that were put together by Jason Furman. I don't exactly know where the numbers came from, but this is AI capital as a share of business fixed capital. It's about 0.1%. I mean, it's tiny. Now, what does that mean? So it means that there's room for a lot of growth here, and maybe there'll be a lot more spending on AI, so it will impact our lives a lot more. But also, let's not lose sight of like the really big picture, which is still stuff that matters is infrastructure investment, manufacturing, service investment. All of this stuff is really what businesses spend most of their money on. So I'll stop sharing now.
Good.
And I'll mute myself.
No, you don't. Okay.
So I've stopped sharing it. I just want to confirm that now you don't see what I was sharing.
I still see it.
Okay,
now we don't. Yes, it takes some time. Yes, Sam, you wanted to say something?
No, actually, I think Florenta's got a comment. I know she has comments on this.
Okay. Yes,
I mean, you can go ahead. It's all good if you want. I just wanted to add a piece of evidence to what Rob said. So yeah, for sure, AI is everywhere. It's just a matter of labeling. Like Noor said the exact same thing. AI initiatives have been started since 1956. As a number of you know, advancements have been made, recent advancements and more technology. And I mean, if you look at what Noor was talking about, what AI is, the word prediction came up quite often in the way she was describing it. And to add to Rob's evidence, I don't know if I should share my screen or not, but in my research, we are also looking at another piece of evidence, which is job postings throughout the economy. And interestingly enough, this sector of healthcare that we are all so excited about is the lagging sector in adopting AI. So if you're to the question, is AI in other areas? If we believe that AI is making inroads in healthcare, the adoption in other sectors is even larger. Yeah, it's everywhere. It might not be in the format that some of us expect of some sort of a robot or God knows what, but it is in the phone, the Google search, everywhere. I don't know if it's worthwhile to try to share as well, but it is. What is what?
Fine if you want. Yep.
Okay, so that's the adoption by posting of jobs in various sectors of the economy. The sectors of the economy are listed in here, and the bars are showing adoption between 2007 and 2018. You see there's a huge increase, first of all, and that's healthcare, the one with the arrow right there, right? Where the excitement is all about, and we are all so hopeful that, you know, people are going to discover drugs and all that. So I'm hoping to see this popping up even more.
It's hard to see here, but which one is the highest adoption? The
information sector.
I think, of course, that makes
information
sense.
sector. This is scientific, technical services, finance and insurance, manufacturing, mining, interesting enough, all sorts of administrative positions, agriculture, management, educational services, and so on.
Oh, excellent. It's interesting that agriculture has adopted AI more than even healthcare has. That's a very interesting
absolutely.
observation.
I'll stop sharing so I'll let others do it. Okay.
Ali, can I add a few things?
Yes, absolutely.
Based on both my academic hat, but also my McKinsey former life, doing 28 years and doing a lot of AI. I wanted to share 3 observations about the discussion so far. The very first one, indeed, is that whether there is adoption or not, really depends on the scope of how we define AI, as we discussed. And at this stage, I think the 2 really drivers of AI is video recognitions and machine learning as key drivers. The rest is still very much in the limbo. Second observation, when we look at the dynamics of the AI, it's not too much that we are in the early days, we all know that. But when we do the adoptions dynamics and we try to collate that with classical drivers of the intrinsics of the value proposition of AI versus competition, uncertainty, you name it, you see a pretty much the same profile for any type of technology. That's not that AI is quite different. The only difference with AI is that, surprisingly, what we find is that the drivers of competition, so more competitive pressure, happens to make people decide faster to adopt AI. Now, whether it's linked to AI per se, I don't know. It's possibly we control, obviously, from the fact that you have the right architecture behind that, which is big data, which is the cloud. Even if we control for that, we see that the peer pressure seems to be slightly faster. The coefficient of inference is in the range of twice any type of technology before. So there seems to be an acceleration. That's the second observation. And 3, hold on. The biggest difference, obviously, some sectors are more advanced than some others. ICT is obviously one of those because they have to sell that, and they basically use that as a way to reinforce their market presence and the legacy of what they've done so far. You know, there is no point not to do AI if you are Google and not to impose a standard of big data in this case. But the key difference that we find is between firms within the same sectors, and it's much more a digital. The AI divide is bigger than the digital divide, and that's in one way worrisome. That simply means that people have no capabilities to really understand what AI is. 2, they don't have the capabilities to perform stuff in AI. And I think, no, you made the point as well. There are just a lot of interesting case. But when you go and discuss with people, you come to realize that even if they have data, so they always debate about, hey, we don't have the data, we cannot do it. I say, look, as you said, you know, small data is possibly the way that we're going to be obliged to do a lot of those things, especially in the B2B space than in the B2C space. But on top of that, even people are sitting on tons of data, and usually they don't know how to use it. The classical example is that if you want to do AI-based maintenance in oil and gas, I can tell you the data are pretty much all over the place. They already have sensors, but they don't know how to use the data. The cloud technology is there, but they don't know how to use it. And at best, I would say 2% of the data is used by the average company who today have established the architecture to do that, The CTO has possibly have done a good deal to have the investment in the architecture. The CRM guys or the digital guys on the marketing or whatever will have put the data somewhere, but they just have a tough time to use them.
Do you think such a divide will create inequalities in different sizes in the industries, and how do you think that will play out in the future if we assume that AI creates significant efficiencies?
Yeah, I think it's nothing more than AI is just an improvement to the set of digital technologies that we have, and obviously they build upon each other. And as we know, because of that, you have a technology learning curve that basically means that it's very difficult to see convergence in companies. Obviously, after 20 years, you will see it, but the market will have been structured, established, and the top three will still be dominating. So the point for me is that the catch up on the adoption is actually very small. To the capabilities, the dynamic capabilities. Most of the time, the guys who do AI, they don't do it for the sake of doing AI as an extension to what they do. Obviously, some do at the marginal space, but a lot of the people are using that as a breakthrough model innovation. And the guys who are doing that requires fundamental capabilities that are quite unique. You need radical innovation, mindset, and you name it. And so, yes, indeed, it will create, let's not call them like we said sometime in the church here, superstar versus the rest, but there is a tendency of discrimination. And it's a very important point because that will lead to another questions to all of our colleagues here, which is there is a lot of other discussions like, is AI and automation going to kill a lot of jobs? I once have written a small article saying it's actually the absence of adopting AI that's going to kill more of the jobs, simply because the companies that are very good in AI will actually extend their market share and will possibly innovate with AI and will obviously start to compete against the laggards. And the laggards one day will be such out of the cost curve or the product market fit that they would have no choice to fight people because they just going to be out of the market. So the point is that it's a very competitive landscape. There is all this discussion from the ICT suppliers, the standard, the implicit standard, the patent element. By the way, I love the page on the patent, but the patent is very driven by the Chinese companies are patenting like crazy. The US guys are already the big guys. They say we're going to be much more subtle. We do a bit of patent, but we try to give free version of what we do and impose a TensorFlow or whatever else as a de facto standard, so they don't play on the patent side. So that's also another way to look at this thing, is very diffuse. But the competition space is quite fascinating, but it's not a technology space. It's the technology enabled that kind of a new competition. And from a strategic management point of view, it's a fascinating space because we have a great experiments, especially through AI.
So, Sam, did you want to add anything? And
Sure. Actually, I thought, Florent mentioned the word prediction that she picked up on what Noor was saying. I think there's a word see that's showing up a lot of places. Noor talked about many of the things that she's seeing. I'm not seeing any of those. And not that I'm not saying they don't exist. I'm just saying they're not visible to me outside of her industry. And so I think there's an element of the beautifully boring about AI. We all see these videos of the robots running around and cool humanoid looking things. I'm much more excited about those things that I can't see. And I know Florence has talked about measuring it. Rob has talked about measuring it. These are very hard to measure, but I think they're going on. And I think they're going on, I might call them smoldering. We're not seeing huge fires. We're seeing lots of smoldering that I think are going to start to catch in a few big places, just because of what we can't see. A lot is happening in the background.
But Sam, on the point you make, that's true, and I will add an additional element, which is a lot of these technologies, they look like funky and all that, but sometimes they use is just basic optimization, which is great and it's very industry specific, but it does not create the breakthrough. So the fundamental question is that for AI can enable you to better track to better collect data, to better solve complex problems, can do a lot of optimization. Where I think we see those breakthrough and where it's exciting to work in those fields, so busy in the discovery innovation space. And that's where we see real breakthrough from an enterprise point of view. So there are a lot of cases that are great optimization we cannot do before, but we don't necessarily see it because it's embedded in basic processes. And in automation, just to add a comment to your point, watch out, because a lot of the case of AI we see use AI, but from a very tiny elements. I mean, a lot of the machine learning requires data more than AI. And if you look at the robotics, the bottlenecks of robotics is not AI, it's mechanical engineering. It's just to make sure that the robots can actually follow what the AI prediction is going to do. And if you want a robot to work or a car to drive nicely, you need to have prediction in real time and the flexibility of the engineering to make it work, which is much more complex than AI.
Right, Jacques, speaking about some of the combinations here, we talk about an optimization in one area, and that's going to lead to something. But when those things get combined with multiple optimizations in different areas in new ways, I think that's where I get more excited. We have an example of a mining company, and their fantasy is to tie spot market prices with where they dig in Africa. So if they can measure what the price of an ore is in China and the spot market, and they can tell someone today, dig to the left, not to the right. That's the fantasy. Now, obviously, a lot has got to get into place before Anglo American can do that, but it speaks to more of a transition from this single process approach to multiple processes. And that's where I get very excited when these things start to connect to each other.
Sure.
I want to build on something that Jacques said earlier. He talked about how the deployment of AI could change competition. And I would like to know your opinion on what can firms do to either take advantage of these coming changes or prepare for the challenges that these will bring. How can they respond to these changes?
I think one of the points that the other, basically pretty much everyone touch on is basically the availability of data as kind of one of the main pillars for AI. Without data, AI really can't do anything. So it's for AI to work, it either needs to kind of progress to the phase where it doesn't really have to work on a lot of data, or it has to kind of, data needs to be available for AI to work. And that's where competitive advantages comes in for kind of more kind of legacy companies spend years and years collecting and curating those data sets, which just at the moment sit there and anybody can actually doesn't know what to do with it. So it's an interesting, I think, playground for small companies who can forge early collaborations with big companies who have that data that's sitting there, and bringing in those kind of superstars, expertise to kind of mine and bring in the kind of the crown jewels in those data sets. I think the companies that can manage to do that will have a unique advantage in terms of not just building the technology, because the technology by itself is not really valuable as long as you can show what it can do for certain tasks. So by forging these collaborations, some of the companies manage to do that, say, for instance, in radiology, in pathology, and so on and so forth, so that you can start mining those images, those databases, and start bringing those early diagnostics for cancer patients, or figuring out what drug effects for which subpopulation, for instance. So that's kind of one angle. But we've also seen companies who are just focusing on AI and then get swapped by the big players just because the technology fits very nicely with the data that they have. So I guess when it comes to the reality, it's always the case that big players will have the advantage, either because they have the data or because they have enough money to buy the kind of most innovative companies and bring in that technology. But only the companies who are kind of visionary and to innovate and being able to kind of be open-minded to this new technology will be able to maintain that kind of unique advantage and unique competitiveness in the space.
So how can a company that doesn't have that all experience, how can they join in this race, which at this point seems like it will be a race where the winners will keep winning?
No, Ali, I don't think this is true. I think the point, again, if you take the strategic management hat, I think if you take the resource-based view, we say if companies, there are companies that basically have access to a lot of data, customers and all those things, but today what I've seen is that they don't necessarily have the capability to harvest this data, and two, they don't have the skills to get people to translate what the algorithm will even say to actionable elements for product deployment, for redefinition, beside the classical optimization element. So that's fair that you can do AI maintenance and preempt people to basically go into the oil and gas sites and do that. You're going to save a bit of cost, but it does not change. It does not move the needle. You still in the playing field, but it doesn't move the needle. And so to me, we got the resource base and we got the capability, the digital capability view. And in fact, the companies that are very good are actually mixing both of them. Some are extreme in the digital capability, some, but there is a danger of, I don't like the wording, which is the monopolizing of the data, or the control of the data, and these kind of things. But I think another point that we see is that the big guys are actually having possibly the resource-based. They have also the finance-based. They already have quite a few capabilities, but the metabolic rate of winning on this thing is quite fast, even for Google. So the things they do, they just buy a lot of very small companies. So in fact, the competence happens to be at the level of the startup, and they just buy them because they think that's great. And two, they buy them because they buy the talent more than anything else. Are they good in doing it? I won't tell you my analysis. My analysis suggests that they are good in having the people. Is the return on investment that good? Today you don't see it. Maybe you will see it because the dynamic capabilities aspect will help them to consolidate the market. But that's the way we should look at this. And frankly, today, on your question, is it fair or unfair? I don't know. I don't have any answer. It seems to me where we see a lot of this, funny dynamics of strategic of industrial organization, strategic management issue of an M&A and the like, are in sectors that have a lot of are already in the middle of the war of AI, and frankly, the way to compete in this environment seems to suggest it's very difficult to have all the assets, capabilities, resource to dominate. So you're going to need to buy. You're going to need to be part of a large ecosystem and whatever else. And I think one of the reasons why we see the system behind the multi-market element and everything else is simply it's very difficult to own all the assets and be in the top three of this class of assets and competence. To be honest, that is my hypothesis.
If I may,
oh, sorry, Noor.
If I may add to this whole thing, a 10,000 feet high-level view from a scholar's perspective, not practitioner. A starting point to look at these technologies is to try to understand what type of technology AI is, right? So we know a lot about patterns of adoption in industries and patterns of technological development in R&D. And they all depend on the type of technology, the capabilities of the technology, what the technology can do. There's a lot of hypothesizing about AI being what scholars call a general purpose technology. I have some work on that as well. The answer seems to be more nuanced than what it seems at first glance, in the sense that it brings these points together that we heard. It's not just AI, which is mainly a prediction technology at this point. It also requires an input, so data, and it also requires some sort of a method of interpreting the output, so data science and so on. All those together, according to read my research as well and others, could have this attributes of general purpose technology. So once we know that, what does that mean? It means that this particular technology is what we call an enabling technology. So by itself, it might not do much. And to give you an example, these general purpose technologies are very rare. They come maybe once in a generation, and others would be electricity or computers, internet. And by themselves, they don't do much, right? If you think about electricity being invented, it doesn't do anything unless you have a light bulb or you have an engine or something, right? So it requires complementary assets for innovation in order to actually reap the benefits of this particular technology. So it's similar, I believe, with what we see with AI, right? When it comes to competition and firms, in order to reap the benefits of this technology, it requires a lot of investment in complementary assets. And those complementary assets can come internally from internal capabilities, or they can come externally from alliances, mergers, acquisitions, coordination of innovation, and so on. It requires a lot of investment in innovation that needs to bridge between academia and industry in order to actually bring that expertise that you're all talking about with star scientists and so on to try to understand the application sectors for this particular technology. And the benefits of this technology are not guaranteed, right? So if the right ingredients are not coming together, then we might risk of seeing this value accruing to more monopolist positions because who has the capabilities of bringing the complementary assets in. So policy should play a role in this of how to ensure that competition is fair and smaller players perhaps have a chance to occupy a role and all that. And another interesting thing when look at this technology from a general purpose technology perspective, the companies that create value in the space are not necessarily the ones that capture the value from the space, right? There's a lot of investment, but a lot of the value is generating public goods, and the value is being captured by other companies, right? So the nature of competition is very interesting when it comes to this type of technology.
This is Rob. Can I piggyback off of Florenta's comments?
Sure.
First of all, the point about complementary assets, sort of two things I want to say. So first of all, the point about complementary assets that Florenta made, I think is super, super important. And I think it's also worth pointing out, it's not just that you invest in AI and then the complementary assets. The big issue is you don't know what those complementary assets are for the most part. This is part of the reason why in general, with any type of new technology adoption, it takes a while before you start to see, at the organization level, before you start to see productivity improvements. It takes time to identify what the complementary assets are and to arrange them in the appropriate way. So yes, complementary assets are very important. That's sort of one point. The other point is, and I like how Florenta used the term prediction technology instead of AI. I want to demystify stuff even further. We're talking about software. Like quite literally, that's what we're talking about. And I like to use that term instead of a term like AI or machine learning. You know, one could argue these are misnomers. There's nothing intelligent. There's no learning going on. It's just quite literally software. Very sophisticated software, but just software. Now, so the point I want to make on that is that most companies, right? So most managers are not going to be creating this very sophisticated software. They're just going to be using it in their job. And so I think the big question is, as a manager, when do you think that this sophisticated software is going to work well? And when would you be worried about it not working well? And so, you know, one thing I would worry about is, well, if this was, you know, for example, if I'm in a consumer-facing firm, if this was sophisticated software that was created pre-March 2020, the world is now a totally different place. How good is this sophisticated software for me now? That's the type of thing that I would worry about as a manager in a firm.
Very good. Can I piggyback on Rob's point, because I think it's a great discussions to have. We talk about competition, we tend to be very simplistic, and I totally buy Florenta and Rod's point about complementary assets and capabilities, because without that nothing will happen. But also, in my experience, I think I have two other things to add to the conversation. The very first one is that the uncertainty around the use cases is still very, very high. And again, there is funnily enough, I think the companies that are investing in those technologies sometimes suffer from the optimistic bias. So I think there is also a real management fat sometimes, or whatever else. But the way people believe about how they hedge risk, or if they take risk as an opportunity and the like, that kind of a discussion about whether you should be early mover versus late mover is still a very complex problem. Our own simulation came to the conclusion that being just not early mover, but just after that is actually better. And there are two reasons, by the way. One is that the uncertainty makes that there's not a lot of sunk cost, by the way, into this technology. It's very cheap. And it's not very high cost versus what you do. But the problem is that if you don't have the capabilities to make it happen, nothing will work out. And the sunk cost attached to the wrong capabilities for an early mover, basically, if you hire a team of 10 people plus you invest in whatever in the wrong cloud, heavy infrastructure, you possibly have a cost of risk which is too high. And the second point is that the average Joe firm will never have the capacity to compete directly and have the assets to compete with the big guys from the digital sphere. So it's better to wait and smell. That's the first observation. And the second observation, so there is a time-based competition, but watch out, it's not as easy as we believe, and we have to look at what is sunk, not sunk. And the second observation that I wanted to share is that it's really different sectors by sector. The use case or the materiality of the cases are game changer or not. Some are actually a use case that will be the playing field, but it does not give you any competitive advantage. It gives you a competitive disadvantage if you don't have it, but it does not give you a competitive advantage per se. So if you are in the B2C space, marketing automation give you an advantage if you're the first to know how to integrate all the CRM database and just do AI out of that. That's why an Amazon is that good in doing these things, but it's going to be a playing field. And the day where everybody's going to have it, I just don't think it's going to give you a competitive advantage, except if you find a way to basically create a much more lock-in on the customer. But that's not AI. It's prime Amazon. That's a lock-in factor. It's nothing to do with AI. And so there are cases where AI is simply a playing field add-on, how to compete, but does not give you competitive advantage. But there are cases where, again, when we have innovation, that gives you a lot of advantage. When you have a way where you can combine AI as insight, like you have in some of the healthcare genomics and the like, I believe that you can derive a personalization product space that nobody can match. And there you're going to see competition. So I think it's very important not to look at this as saying it's going to be monolithic. It really depends on the use case in the industry where you are.
So you said that being a first mover is not great, and Noor is saying that being a first mover actually might be able to give you access to better data. So you're both saying basically we need both data and the capabilities to analyze that data to make the most of it.
But can I make a very last point on the data? Because again, this is the devil is in the detail. As you know, you produce per day more data than possibly on the stock of the last year. And so at the end of the day, the question, and frankly, data that are very static from the past that can be useful, but the real-time behavioral data is possibly much more important. So the question is not the stock of data, is what data flows as information theory will say are really valuable for what you do, and what's the replenishment rate of that, and again, in the point of saying, do you have a first move advantage? You can on the data, but fresh data sometimes can be enough to leapfrog.
Noor, would you like to respond?
Yeah. Absolutely. I think that's actually a crucial point. Data is as always, like machine learning or AI models can be just as good as the data you train them on. But there has been a lot of debate, for instance, within the kind of pharmaceutical industry around the value of the internal data that have been created and secured behind those kind of closed doors for decades now. And they basically, it's very hard to share pharma data, and the value of it is not really clear because nobody has seen it and nobody knows exactly whether it's like, is it really ready for AI machine learning? How much work we should put in place to kind of get any value out of it? So there are a lot of players starting off by just creating their own data, machine learning or like computationally, digitally ready data, so that we can reap as much value of it as we can. So I think the pillars for me is really kind of data, talent, and AI. If you need kind of domain expertise to know exactly what problem you're solving, and that kind of lead to curating and collecting the right data for the problem you're solving. And then with the right talent and the right expertise on board, you can bring kind of the value. And what I've seen so far is kind of the innovation really happens usually in the intersections between domains and between sectors. So we've seen a lot of people, for instance, trained in computer science and in AI, and they don't really understand anything about biology or manufacturing or whatever. And when it comes to these people talking to each other, it requires significant amount of time and training just kind of to learn the terms, just to kind of to learn about the problems that they're solving. You can see kind of machine learning and AI as black boxes that you can use for anything, and that's not really the case. They have to be trained and fine-tuned to solve those kind of specific problems. And I think it's coming now to the point where people start to realize that you need to train computer science or machine learning experts to be also biologists and chemists to be able to solve those really hard problems and to be able to understand in the first instance what problem they're solving before they jump in kind of and solve it. So I guess that's kind of my 2 cents on this.
It's actually interesting because we're saying that the problem of the knowledge of the problems is could be in a completely different place than the knowledge of the techniques and the data itself. So there has to be a way of bringing those together.
Absolutely.
You know, you are stumbling upon one other interesting thing that now it has nothing to do with AI. You have the same problem in a number of other innovation efforts, right? That innovation requires coordination across different knowledge domains, and that is an increasingly pervasive problem as knowledge accumulates. The more knowledge we have, the more people are specialized in their own niches, right? I mean, they know less and less about the entire body of knowledge, right? So in order to try to locate the necessary ingredients in order to innovate, it's more complicated because you need to coordinate across this large knowledge space. And unfortunately, in a number of places, the incentives for innovation are geared towards specialization, right? To become the expert in X. We already heard about this a bit today. We are looking for stars in something, right? But this coordination problem, perhaps it does not require just the stars in something. It requires some sort of a mechanism to identify, first of all, what kind of knowledge is being required and needs to be brought together, right? So there's a pre-discovery step in which we need to understand what kind of stars or specialists we need to bring together and incentivize them accordingly to work on these type of problems. For example, in healthcare, where things are lagging and we are also hungry and waiting for something. So kudos to Noor, for working on this space and pushing the agenda forward.
One example of healthcare, we keep bringing healthcare up. I mean, one of the examples that people were excited about a while back was the idea of using optical character recognition to translate faxes. So faxes ship information back and forth across so much of our medical world. And people are excited because, hey, we no longer have to type in the information from faxes. Well, I mean, yeah, that's great and that's wonderful, but maybe just don't send that fax in the first place. And so I think there's a little danger here too, that we get all excited about, hammering on these things with AI because it's the cool tool. I guess I have some worry that healthcare is going to go down that path of optimizing Byzantine processes versus, let's point to Noor because she's on the call, then using it in a different way to find something new, to find something that we haven't done before or something new, rather than just incrementally polishing a Byzantine process.
I think there has been applications across the spectrum, really, like for everything from kind of just digitizing doctor's note, which is like you should be entering those on the kind of the computer in the first place and not writing them down, maybe. But then you have also kind of on the other end of the spectrum, kind of those tools that really help experts excel and go beyond their own capabilities to do something that they haven't really been able to do before. So I think kind of one of the area that we've really seen kind of interesting examples is again back to radiology and pathology, because usually each doctor has specific time on each case, so they don't really get enough time to do a lot of cases, so they tend to kind of speed up the process and make mistakes. And in those kind of areas, I think AI has a great potential, and it's been actually proven that it can bring a lot of values in terms of just flagging the cases that requires more attention, or just kind of deprioritizing the cases where you don't really need, they're not really urgent. And those can really change life. So those are kind of the examples, I think, that AI is kind of almost there in providing values. It's been put into production, people are using it already, and it's saving lives. In drug discovery, it's probably a bit more kind of longer term, just because of all the kind of regulatory issues around getting a drug to market and safety and building efficacious drugs and so on and so forth. The timeline is usually 15 years. So to see something that translates into kind of drug that's been used by patients will take more time. And I think it also requires more kind of thoughtful innovation and bringing in a lot of people with the right background and expertise to the table from different disciplines. And that is, I think, kind of these two are probably kind of the main reasons why we haven't really seen AI providing a lot of value in those areas so far.
Well, but so value is one thing, but I think there are differences in incremental value versus huge value, and I think we can find lots of places of value. I think it's harder to find those cases of massive value.
Disruption, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So breakthrough is hard, but small changes are happening that are adding value, and cumulatively that might be more than the rest. So
you're on mute, Jack.
The classical example is the case of the COVID. Incidentally, I was just looking at the digital startup in the space and what kind of things they've done. First, it was very exciting to see that there were just a lot of those trying to do good. So they were not necessarily looking at a business model per se, but just try to do things. But what you see is that the combination of 5 or 6 AI elements were adding already quite a bit of value, but when you aggregate the full system of AI into the COVID space, it's quite important because, for instance, I've seen cases where AI is used to personalize a 3D printing of these respirators or whatever it's called, on the equipment side. And the question was, how do I make sure I create that in a flexible material so it can be reused, but it has to be personalized, because the way you are held by the machine is to be very specifically designed for your lung. And the only way to do it on a scalability stuff is that the AI should do it. Obviously, you can do it to test what's happening in your lung. You can basically, the European Union is using a lot of the supercomputing elements to try to match every molecules and every medicine existing, so that we don't have to develop the new medicine and say which one can basically be a combination of drugs that are both affordable but can be at least effective from a cure point of view, not obviously from a vaccine point of view. And if you look at all these elements, I think AI is adding quite a bit. And in total, I think that AI has shown more breakthrough than anything that I've seen around the dynamics of the COVID-19 today. The same thing about doing a mask and everything else. You can predict things, you can do a lot of things. And it is a surprising thing because I work on that and try to help the government. The very first thing where AI would have been fantastic, it's again an organizational issue, which is, do you, and I'm quite sure you are from different countries than mine in Belgium. I ask whether somebody had a predictive model, at least a first basic Excel spreadsheet model to say, how many masks will you need? And obviously every hospital in Belgium obviously has its own procurement. They don't do it together. So everybody has this mental model of the world. So some people say, well, this thing's going to go like 3 times bigger than what the other guys think. And nobody had a clue how to integrate this into a global model and get a procurement element and say, instead of going to China where it's closed, let's go to South Korea. The only way we managed to do it was obviously to get these people to talk together, but also to use multiple tools to make sure they converge. We use a bit of the AI tools, but the tools is much more simulation. What happened if you are to bake and the like. But the interesting point is that even if you think about doing things that are very predictive, the bottleneck is usually human. Is the frustration of COVID here was, how do you allocate equipment across multiple? You can do all the mathematical modeling. You can be doing a great AI model if you like to predict things. You still need to ship it. You still need to get the people to agree, and you still have to get the money for people to pay. And the hospital don't have it. So it's very funny, but we come back to, it's a tool. It's a fascinating tool. But boys, it requires a lot of complementary elements, and there's still a lot of bottlenecks to make it happen.
Actually, that's a very good segue to my next question. What kind of policies, public policy, do we need to make AI even more efficient or make its adoption better? One thing that at some point in the UK happened was Google's, then before it was actually Google, I think DeepMind acquired some NHS data and they mismanaged it, so that didn't work out. But the public institutions have a lot of data that could be useful, especially in healthcare, which is my area. But what other policies can you imagine would help the adoption of AI? Or its better use, not necessarily adoption?
So I don't want to go too much on an extreme tangent here, but that's the purpose of a panel, is to be extreme. If you think about what happened in the United States in the turn of the 1900s, Upton Sinclair wrote a book called The Jungle that was about the meatpacking industry and how abysmal food production was in the United States. So this is related. This is related because I think we have just as much abysmally happening behind the scenes in so many AI implementations and in data that we just don't have any transparency and ability to see. So for some of these things to progress like that, I think we're going to have, we're going to need, and I hate to say the word regulation, but I feel like that there's an element of that. We need some sort of way to get more visibility into so many of these processes. And we've seen so many failures in that over the last, even recently in the last year. I can't help but we're wondering, we're coming to an Upton Sinclair moment here where we're going to need to clean up, or else we're not going to trust. We trust the food we consume now. I don't think we trust the output of algorithms.
Absolutely. Any other opinions here? Because, yeah, Rob?
Yeah, so just a couple of quick thoughts. I mean, sorry, you probably hear the New York City.
They're coming for you, Rob.
It's a good one.
They're coming for my children, probably. They can take. I'm kidding. So yeah, just a couple of thoughts. I mean, first of all, by the way, you know what would be great? Here's a business idea out there for everybody. You know how we can do the backgrounds to like get rid of whatever visual background we don't want? We need to do that for audio, so we can like get rid of whatever audio.
Yeah, I think it's the mute button.
Let's come up with some AI that can do that. I think that would be. I think that'd be a great invention. So I tend to agree. Just let me say this as a just in terms of background. I tend to agree with something that Jacques said early on about AI not necessarily being a substitute for labor, but nevertheless, it is something that we do want to worry about a little bit. I worry especially about at least the tax structure in the U.S., which tends to favor capital over labor. That's just the way the corporate tax structure is set up. And so, I'll be honest, I don't know how this works in other countries. But I would worry about in the US as a result of the existing tax structure that might incentivize firms to look to AI solely as a way to substitute for human labor. And so if we were worried about that, then one thing we might think about is whether it makes sense to change our existing corporate tax policy. Okay, so that's one thing. In terms of like competition issues, I do worry about the fact that, there's some really big companies that have a ton of data, as well as other resources that are the ones that are making all the breakthroughs and creating value, to Florento's point, creating value, but also probably capturing a lot of it. I think we would get even more innovation and sort of spread of this new technology if it was the case that smaller companies had a shot at this. And so sort of competition policies to think about would be things like data portability or data sharing and things like that. There are all sorts of technical issues that need to be worked out and sort of bounds that need to be put on this. But, I think that those types of policies are worth thinking about. And there are even some more radical ones, which would be use then delete policies when it comes to data, right? So if you've collected data from a consumer, you as a company don't get to keep it for forever, but maybe you get to keep it for 2 weeks and then you have to delete it. That should, that's the data that's probably most important, especially when it comes to consumer-facing businesses. And B, that should at least help smaller companies get a little bit more of a shot at creating the big breakthrough before the Googles and the Apples and the Amazons of the world do. So just a few thoughts there.
Mm-hmm. Excellent, thank you. Would anybody else like to add something? And then I'll open it to the audience. Go ahead.
I have quite a few, but let me give you a few anyway. So I want first to get back to Rob's point, which is, in my experience, I never seen a company who basically called me when we were just doing AI stuff, where they say, we just want to have a use case on efficiency. So I understand the corporate tax and the like, but let's not be necessarily always badly, the company is bad. Usually when they want AI is because they have no clue what they want in the first place. But most of the time it's innovation, is very functional specific versus enterprise wide. And they don't think that way of saying, I'm going to automate people. In effect, the consequence is that some tasks will be automated, some will be replaced. But again, it's like the day you got your PC, your assistant was possibly had to no longer to type and do different things. So my first point is that let's not necessarily over regulate or whatever else, because otherwise it will not work. Point number two, I also believe the monkey is not only on enterprise and people, it's on the government itself. I take a simple example. If we have video recognition tools that are extremely effective, I think they are a fascinating tool to use because it can optimize very complex system dynamics problem like traffic. I think it's wise to have it. Is it wise to all the data of video recognition in the streets of what you do and keep it and just use it for spotting who you are or influence you? Some rogue states possibly could use that, and I think that the ethical value. I'm looking at Sam. I'm trying to make it controversial a bit here, but you see where I'm going, which is ethical AI is a big theme that I think it's a premise of those policies. And last but not least, at the end of the day, the future of AI, if I make it simple, is also the future of skills. And the future of skills, and again, Rob, you have alluded to it in one way, but what we see is that the best jobs in the future, and by the way, Florentine has sort of the same vision, which is the jobs where we see both a demand increase, in some case even an excess demand, and a wage increase together is what I call the hybrid jobs. Is that the people who basically have social creativity and all these things that AI cannot do, but or have the capability to translate what AI does say to a funny algorithm, so that's the domain expertise, but also they are very scientific, so that at least they can manipulate these tools, so at least be in an interface with this tool, which is you have a good brain, you are technical, you are engineers and the like. So the hardcore talent of skills plus the creativity is where we start to see the biggest increase in both demand and in wages. And obviously, if you are just a geek, but you don't have the social skill, AI would not help you. And if you are just social and no skill, it's fine, but you will not go somewhere either. If you have none of them, it's even worse. So that simple segmentation tells me as well that in this environment, the education policy and the radical thinking about the education policy and the online learning, because if you do it on education, you do it for the next generation in 10 years, but AI is today, or at least it's starting today. How do you create this kind of hybrid skill opportunity? And is there a way to finance? Is there a way to do more public-private partnership with companies like well, there are a few online education companies, of course. I would not the Coursera of these words, but it could be finance as well. So the education could be an interesting space for the public to be complement instead of regulate by itself. Mm-hmm. I stop.
Yeah. Anyone else want to add something before I open this to the audience? So there were a couple of questions. One comes from James. He says a big potential area for AI in healthcare is pattern recognition. Long talked about, but now becoming possible. As ever, it's not the tech that's the barrier, but organizational, regulatory, and business model issues that are the constraints. How might we address that at the organizational level? And I see more questions coming in.
So I think some of the, if we think about this, I like the organizational, emphasis of that question because, and I think Noor mentioned the example of radiology, and that's obviously been an early example of an application. But I guess the point here is, how can we make all the radiologists smarter at one time? And that's where I see the potential. Yeah. That we don't one-off train people. We're training, we're getting some sort of scale for learning. And if you think about organizational learning as the goal of this versus one-off learning, I don't know. I feel like that's exciting to me in a way that this one-off, can we improve this, true false, true negative, false positive, false negative of the individual radiology assessment? How can we get all working together? And that kind of twists the question, sorry, but that's what it brought up in my mind.
That's interesting. How does one spread a specific practice to multiple organizations? That's incredibly hard. And that's
AI. I think that's the promise of what I see here. We started talking about some of the smoldering effects and some of these, lots of different things. And Florentina mentioned it as the the general nature and the insidious nature, if you want to use a more negative word. But that insidious is good because it does allow that organizational learning to spread rapidly.
I just want to ask the audience if they have any questions that they can either open their mic and ask or type in the chat. In the meantime, we don't really have that much time, but what is one wicked problem that we have in this world that AI might potentially help us solve? The most important problem to you that AI might solve or improve? We've talked a lot about the challenges and how it might make things worse for replacing humans and so on. But what can AI make better that we haven't been able to do?
Well, I will give you my, maybe not the answer you want, but I think it's from a scientific point of view, I think it's a change of mindset, because I always make the fun of it. When I did my master's degree in '85, I was doing that in the States, and I was doing some forecast of the GDP of the US using filtering techniques and you name it. But guess what? I was just using 30 data points, annual data points of GDP to get the next one. And obviously, based on that, the statistical analysis was very simple. And I got something very significant, which means it's really different from what I observe. And that was the theory, as you know, because you cannot replicate, and the beta risk was obviously minimized. With AI and data, a lot of experimentation can happen in social science, which means that we don't have to always be binding by, I really need to make sure that this is significantly different to do that, because I can do a lot more experimentation. And by the way, even statistics science is evolving nicely in saying there is possibly more information in the fact that it's not statistically significant than statistically significant in some of the experiments. And I think what AI brings is, and big data brings, is a way to crunch and experiment, but also to put that in perspective where it's more data driven in one way, but complex system dynamics, a complex problem, we cannot structure that correctly in any case. So I think it's always good to have the simulation. Now, whether these things make sense, I still believe we need a structure of statistic and hypothesis behind that. Otherwise, the scientific method will not work, because it's data ingestion, garbage in, garbage out. But that's to me one of the key, the key evolution, which is not AI per se, but AI plus big data possibly create a scientific method that is possibly going to be different and much more powerful than in the past. The limitations are changing, but the black box is possibly increasing.
That's actually interesting, because we have a question related to that. I would like to hear more discussion on how AI would be affecting innovations and productivity growth, especially the AI competition among countries from a global perspective. If you have any views on that.
What is productivity? Labor productivity, total productivity? What are you? What's the question?
It says just productivity growth. I think the idea is more about how would it change innovation and creativity, and then through that productivity growth.
Well, every technologies happen to deliver some productivity at a certain point, and as we say, it's going to take time for this technology like the other one. So to me, the funny question is not whether there's going to be productivity and competition between states. I think we see that today much more from political perspective, because Europe is squeezed between the US and China, the story says. Whether it's true or not, I don't know. I'm much more concerned about the fact that people will kill AI for different type of wrong reasons because they don't see the impact. And I think the impact takes time, not because you have AI, is because it needs to diffuse at a larger scale, and that's Sam's point as well, which is we need a broad synchronization. And the simulation we have done, if we assume that if we believe what companies are really doing with AI and the use case and the like, let's make a basic case and say, look, the adoption of these technologies will be in large companies at half what it at 50% by in 10 years time. The productivity implication of the use case means that you will see a productivity uplift only by 2026. So that means that, and so here's the funny thing. It goes back to the political policy and all these things, which is that between 2000 and 2026, that's at least 2 years of a US election, or 2 times Macron being elected. No, but that means that they can say whatever they want and influence, and they will never be accountable for the policies they will be taking on these things. So to me, the final question is not that there is productivity. We all know technologies are neither good or bad. That's the use of what you do. But I still believe that the innovation and the complex, but this technology are obviously complex to master, hopefully. but they are innovative enough, and if they are used for the goods, they will significantly scale productivity. Hopefully, they will scale well-being as well, but we will not necessarily see it before in 5 years' time. So whatever decision you make to guide AI today, you have no feedback loop to say you were right before 5 years. So you can be saying, oh, you know, I didn't know, I got a mistake, but who cares? I'm no longer in power, and all these things. So I'm much more interested in the sociopolitics about these technologies, to be honest.
Okay, excellent. Does anybody else want to add to that? There's another question by Maria. I don't know if you guys can see in the chat. I will repeat this one.
No.
What do you think is a greater influencer, cognition or data, while taking data-driven decisions in the business sphere?
Yeah, we're terrible about that.
As a business professor who sits in a management department and does strategy work, as opposed to sitting in an IS department and teaching machine learning techniques, I'm going to say that the cognition matters a lot more, and your sort of the approach that you take to managing a firm. You can learn all the fancy data-driven decision-making techniques in the world, right, or sort of data techniques, but if you're not approaching it with sort of a what are the causal factors here? What's driving these sort of underlying changes that we're seeing? What are the counterfactuals at play? Right, all the stuff that a management and strategy scholar would think through. Then I think you'll be lost.
Technology will quickly become commoditized, like always. That it's a tool. And this one maybe more than many others because there's so much openness right now. So it's going to be the limitation of the human bottlenecks. When you back to tying that to the productivity question, we get focused on company productivity statistics. I would just be thrilled if some of these things that I read about could help me spend waste less time in my personal life. Like, I'm getting an email here from a student who can't come to class, and did I miss anything? No, sunshine. When I shut things down when you don't come to class. Well, I need to have an automated response to that so that my snark doesn't come through. And at the micro level and the micro task level, I think we have worlds of opportunity for productivity gains at the individual level. And to even go further, we need those because we need individually working AI to counter these market forces of the monopolistic companies who are going to be working hard with their AI against us as individuals, trying to extract information about us individually. I think we need to think about, the intelligent assistant argument that we all need to be filtered through an AI individually. So that's another extreme position that's not on the, not on the organizational level, but more on the individual productivity.
We are almost out of time, so I would like to thank you all for participating. We have some more questions in the chat if you would like to answer them. This has been a tremendous discussion. I loved learning from you, and I hope we can continue this debate and conversation in the future. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.